Check podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Thank you so much for being here, for listening on your pod device of choice, and for being with us each and every week as we break down all the stuff that's going on in BC politics. A number of topics this week. We're going to talk about the labor deal or labor peace that might be coming here in the BCGEU / other union settlement arena. We have the public accounts, the financial state of the province. We have also rural healthcare concerns percolating, and we're going to talk about the toxicity rising in politics and the effect that's having on the political process. Joining me this week, we have Jeff Ferrier, Vice President of Hill and Knowlton. Jeff, thank you for being here.
Howdy, Rob. It's always great to be here.
Thank you. And Jillian Oliver, Green Strategist Extraordinaire. Jillian, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
We are going to jump into labor peace first. The BCGEU called off of its picket lines at liquor and cannabis warehouses, ended an OT ban this week for, as the Premier put it, a tentative deal. Not technically a tentative deal yet, but very, very close. Better, obviously, offer on the table from the government than the last one, which was an average 11% wage increase over 3 years and a $2,500 signing bonus. And just before we started recording this episode, news that the Facilities Bargaining Association, basically the HEU, and its 60,000 members in the healthcare sector have an actual tentative deal, the first one. They were making, and said publicly, they were making great progress at the table before the BCGEU strike. So I think that might have maybe put a little bit of pressure on the GEU as well to get back to the table. We don't know what the deal is with the HEU, and we don't know what the tentative offer is with the GEU, but it's certainly going to have to address inflation and other aspects of recruiting and keeping people on the job and training, that type of thing. So this is good news, Jeff. We'll start with you. Good news, but also we don't quite know the financial cost, but how do we wrap our head around these tentative deals?
Hey, first thing I'll say is collective bargaining. You can't beat it. See what I did there?
That's what the Premier said too.
Yeah.
It works. The system works.
Can't beat it. Last week, Rob told folks that my view on collective bargaining was that the unions should just eat it. But I'm saying collective bargaining, you can't beat it. Look, this is good.
Negotiating.
Exactly. You get people, government and workers at a table, both coming in good faith and trying to hammer out their differences, something everyone can live with. And it looks like we're going to have not one, but potentially two collective agreements in 1 week. That's a big deal for government. So BCGEU, for folks at home who may not be following this closely because you're on your docks or on your deck and enjoying the last sunny days of summer, BCGEU represents government workers. They're the reason right now why if you're having a party, your liquor supply stinks. At my local purveyor of spirits, the only thing that was left was Nanaimo Bar whiskey. So
I'm you might as well. I cannot. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I cannot recommend that for your health.
I didn't even know it existed. But so that it's good for me, but it's good for, there's a lot of folks in the hospitality sector who were hurting a lot because of this. So I make fun a little bit, but it's a big deal. They've got to finalize a deal and get ratification by union members before that becomes a reality. So fingers crossed. The health agreement, which I heard about this morning, is a great big deal, and it's really interesting on the policy front. So it's 9 health unions. They represent about 60,000 hospital and long-term care workers. They struck a deal with health. And we don't know exactly what's in the deal, but we know what the union has said is in the deal. And they've said, this is them, not me, significant compensation improvements, reduced workload, commitment to hiring thousands of new workers, and return of more workers who have been contracted out to the private sector coming back into the public system. If that's true, if that's ratified, that signifies that the government in the next budget is going to be making big investments in healthcare and have workers standing shoulder to shoulder with them to make that done. And given everything that we're hearing from rural communities and ERs about access to healthcare, that's a great big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the government can not invest in healthcare at this point, given the crisis that exists. But you're right. If they can get the union standing beside them saying this is enough, that would certainly be politically a very strong position. Jillian, the strike from the GEU was designed to exert pressure on the government, but it seemed like the blowback in the hospitality sector, the kind of throttling of liquor, which forced rationing at public liquor stores, at public liquor stores, but also, bars and restaurants and cannabis businesses saying, they were financially hurt by this, did also kind of lead to a little bit of public pressure back on the union itself. How do you think those dynamics played into the GEO going back to the table and that deal maybe being happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's thinking back to previous public sector strikes that we've had over the years. It wasn't too long ago that we had kids not able to go to school and much more significant job action that was a lot more disruptive than this, I thought. But I think we're in a situation where, it's really hard to hire, where businesses are just sort of recovering from COVID, where they didn't need to turn up the pressure too much to really for the government to feel the urgency, because I think that sense of urgency is already there. So I think it was it was an appropriate amount of job action given the circumstances, and I think it's positive that the government responded quite quickly, because I think, like you said, frankly, we can't afford both for our businesses in the hospitality sector to be feeling any more pressure. We certainly can't afford to be losing any more healthcare workers. We have to stop the bleeding and stop people from quitting that profession, like we already know they are. And also, at least and create a baseline where we can start attracting more people, because I think we're going to talk about it later in the episode, but the healthcare system is in a quite precarious situation at the moment.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting time to be sort of examining what the government can and can't afford in a labor deal. And one of its arguments was that linking the wage increases to the actual rate of inflation was unaffordable. It was too much money. That was the province arguing that position. And we don't know what the final deal is, but it must be closer to or above that 11% average. It must be some, as the HEU put it, inflation-sensitive wage increases as part of the compensation improvement. So we'll have to see what that is in the cost of the Treasury. There is an argument being made as we move to the next topic that the government has money to make this deal sweeter, and that there was around $10 billion set aside to sort of deal with this. And the government is even in a better financial position, according to the new public accounts that came out this week, that the last fiscal year closed its final books in March of this year, and we just kind of get all the numbers this week, showing that we went from a projected almost $10 billion deficit into a $1.3 billion surplus. So that's the year starting April 2021, when we had, dark times during COVID. Vaccines are out. We don't even have the sort of vaccine kind of mandates really in place as we knew them. And the economy was in the tank, and we weren't sure what was going to happen to March of this year, when the economy roared back to life with tax revenue and spending and real estate and federal aid and all sorts of things contributing to that incredible revenue turnaround. But it leaves the impression that there's money around, $1.3 billion around in a dump truck behind the legislature, as the finance minister put it, when in fact it just goes to the surplus automatically. So is this good news for government? I know that sounds like a dumb question. Jillian, we'll stay with you. Is it good news for government to end the year with a surplus that is already gone towards debt, or does it actually increase pressure on government for things like these wage deals we're talking about, for the healthcare system, for doctors, for all of the crises that are going on, that the public impression that there's a bunch of money around, the government's not spending to solve these things, even though the money is already gone.
Yeah, and I think like the public doesn't. I mean, even I had to do some research into government accounting practices to understand that it like you're describing, it's actually legislated that if there is a surplus, the government has to use it to pay down the debt. So yeah, I don't think it's a great look, and I kind of think that's why we got this in sort of, the dog days of summer here where people are not paying a ton of attention. I think the government wants the attention to be on whatever is coming next in terms of inflation relief. They've foreshadowed that that's coming in the fall. Because I think this has been a year, even though, the economy has been roaring back to life in many ways, where people have been grappling with the cost of living, things like as simple as groceries becoming unaffordable, people having to work multiple jobs to make ends meet, obviously rent and the cost of housing is continuing to skyrocket. We have the same issue kind of that we've had for a long time in BC with our budget, where we see these stronger government revenues, but a lot of that's driven by increased property transfer tax. So, the government's getting more revenue, but housing is also getting more and more out of reach for people at the same time. So yeah, I think it's not as great of a look as it might have been in the past, where governments can kind of just say, look, we're managing finances so well because people are struggling to make ends meet, and because they're struggling to access basic services like healthcare. And that's been really dominating the news this summer.
Mm-hmm. That in the past, you're right, Jillian, like balancing the budget and ending with a surplus, especially the BC Liberals, they trumpeted that as good economic management, prudent fiscal management, and, controlling spending like you control your business or your family finances. But Jeff, ending the year with a surplus, which is good, pick up on that idea that Jillian was mentioning, that it, especially right now, it's weird because this is last fiscal year ending March 31st of this year. Right now, September 2nd, when we record this, the economy is not doing as well. We have dampened consumer spending from inflation, which will lead to less PST. We have a housing market that's stalled, which will lead to less property transfer tax. We have Ottawa that's cut off its billions in aid. We have the economy teetering on the edge of a recession. I think, and we'll get these numbers soon, we're probably a lot closer, if not in a deficit situation in the current fiscal year we're in right now, but the last one just gets put out and shows a surplus, like we've got money to spend. How do we reconcile all those things, and what do you think the public sees in that?
Well, first I'll say it's $10 billion turnaround, and if you're a government, you'll take that 365 days of the year, 366 in a leap year. It's a good problem to have when people see the government in a strong fiscal position and in a better and stronger position to invest in the big issues that we're facing. And I think health and housing and affordability that you both mentioned fit that bill. And so, I think it's a good thing that our economy has come back stronger. Yes, we're facing headwinds. Yes, we've got big challenges. But because I think it's a remarkable achievement for a government during a pandemic year when the economy was in such rough shape that their plan got us to where we are today. BC's rebounded from the pandemic better than anyone expected. But I think it's also worth noting, and I know governments say, hooray for us. I think it's also really important to note that it's a remarkable achievement for British Columbians to be where we're at right now. For the health workers and essential service providers who kept us going through COVID, kept us safe and working during the pandemic. And for all of us who've sacrificed so many things to advance the greater good. And I think, given that, collective effort to get us to where we are today in a stronger position, I think it's a good thing that there's more pressure on government to invest more in health and housing and affordability. And I hope they take up that mantle and do it in their next budget and stop with the reflexive no to any increased spending, and be willing in the next budget to make the investments that are needed to make life better and more affordable for folks. I take some heart in the health deal that we talked about previously as a sign that that's the direction it's going in. I think David Eby going in as premier is going to shake some things up and maybe make some changes on that front. But happy to be in a stronger position to invest any day of the week.
But Jillian, let's just stay on that for a second. How much credit should the government take for this? Because I have seen its MLAs, especially on social media, saying, well, people said the NDP couldn't manage the budgets, and look at us now. And I think that's a pretty double-edged sword, and you touched on it because, for example, the property transfer tax alone was $1.3 billion more than that had been budgeted. That's just money from the red-hot real estate market, which is completely out of reach for most people, which is an enormous political problem for government. And I kind of feel like if you tease out this a little bit, you end up with areas where, the province balanced the budget, but you could make an argument, to use the NDP line from the 2017 election, that it was on the backs of people. It was on the backs of affordability. Yeah. And I wonder about that. What do you make of the taking credit for this and the risks that comes with politically?
Totally. And, it was kind of funny. And I get, this happens in politics all the time, I guess, over time. But you saw the Liberal finance critic come out and say the exact same thing that the NDP and Greens were saying when they were in opposition, that, the Liberals are saying that the economy is so strong, taking all this credit, saying it's healthy. But that really, falls on deaf ears among a public that is not feeling that in their day-to-day life because of the cost of living and how much harder it is on their pocketbooks, on a daily and monthly basis. So I think it's a really fine line they got to walk, and I think that's why why again, like I said, we did see this come out now, and why the government is going to want to put more public emphasis on the spending that's to come in the fall to give people some relief. So yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. And we got lots of people in the PO that were around in the 90s where I think, the government lost, they lost the seat of government because they were seen as being bad for the economy. And I think that's been in the back of their mind. Perhaps, like Jeff said, having some fresh faces there might kind of take a little bit of a different view and avoid falling into that same trap that the BC Liberals did in 2017, where you kind of get a little bit out of touch when you're kind of staring at a balance sheet and it is just not aligning with how people are feeling and experiencing the economy. And then I think the other thing too that's just a practical thing is that a lot of this money is coming from federal transfers. The federal government transferred a ton of money to the provinces, and that's part of what's kind of buoying the government's finances here, which I also thought was funny because this week we also saw the premier come out and reiterate that we can't solve healthcare problems without the feds giving more money, while also announcing a surplus in part because of increased federal transfers. So I think there's a few things to clean up there heading into the fall.
One-time transfers, one-time transfers. You can't do a sustainable health system on one-time transfers. You need stable, ongoing transfers. But point taken.
But Jeff, Jeff, what about that? Like, expand on that, because I think there's a really good point there that when the balance sheet, as Jillian put it, doesn't reflect reality, when you end up with a provincial surplus that goes to debt, when people are living in an incredible time of unaffordability, when your government is politically on the ropes on affordability and coming out with an affordability plan for inflation that it never planned on doing, and we're going to see that next week, payments and ICBC and all sorts of things, that's not really, those things don't align that well. And that's what makes the surplus so interesting and public accounts so interesting, is you can play it off as great economic management, but it's a double-edged sword in the sense that people need help, and they're looking for that money to go towards them in some way. So just kind of respond to that, because I think that dynamic is really interesting. That there are people in the NDP who think that in this government, who think this is a great thing, and might not be seeing the forest through the trees in terms of the public sentiment of what they're expecting from government on spending.
Well, for me, the great thing about it isn't the accounting achievement. It's the ability that this turnaround, the difference it's going to make in the government's ability to invest in people and in priorities. And if we go into the next budget and the government is status quo in terms of how it approaches health and housing and affordability, then I think they've got some real big problems. If they
let me just can I jump?
Okay, go ahead. Fire away.
Let me just jump in there, because I want to ask about that. Like, do you think that the next premier, like Eby, should take the budget into a deficit to make the investments necessary to do the things you already mentioned, healthcare and the crises? Because I kind of think he should seriously consider doing that. The public sentiment right now, they don't care about surplus deficit. They care about helping them live day to day. And I just kind of, if you're talking about making those investments, and I totally agree with you, like those bold investments would be very powerful politically for this government. Should they care about a surplus, I guess is what I'm wondering.
Well, you should always care about a surplus. And I want to reiterate for a BC Liberal Twitter that I don't speak for the government or the Premier's office, but I have zero problems when you're facing a healthcare crisis of going a bit into the red to make some important investments to train and recruit and attract health workers that you need to keep people healthy and safe. And I think it would also, if that were the route that the province went down, it would certainly bolster their case they're making to the federal government that they need a willing partner at the table who invests sustainably in our healthcare system, because if we shouldn't be the only ones. So anyways, I agree with you.
Yeah. I think and we'll probably end up talking about that as we get closer to the budget, that question for this government, the kind of political pressure of the old guard of the 90s that are worried about the idea of the NDP being seen as not good on the economy, and the new guard of David Eby saying, you know what, we got to spend some money to help people here because that's the real issue. And they don't care about a $1.3 billion surplus or a $1.3 billion deficit. If it improves healthcare, it improves ambulances, if it improves homelessness, if it improves all of these things, people might not care about the deficit number at the end of the year.
You will win and lose elections in British Columbia based on, can I get healthcare when I need it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't think the government's going to win or lose an election based on, did we go $1 billion in deficit? Not now. Maybe in the 90s, but not now.
In some ways, by doing that and letting the Liberals sort of tucker themselves out fighting the fiscal issue that no one cares about, you sort of you do see the larger picture, I think, than the sort of immediate budget. But anyways, I found that really interesting, that sort of discussion of surplus and deficit and how well BC did in this week's numbers. Let's move on to rural healthcare. The mayors of Clearwater, Ashcroft, Fort St. John, and Port McNeill have joined forces. They've got some support from Ferrier and Whistler, and there's some emerging other communities as well, to create a sort of united front and pressure the government to improve the collapsing healthcare system in rural and remote communities. ER closures, ambulance service gaps, they're happening everywhere, but in small communities where you have to drive hours to the next facility, or no ambulance means no help at all. You've seen some tragic results. There was an 8-month-old infant that died in Ferrier last week waiting for an ambulance, 2 seniors in Ashcroft separately, cardiac arrest waiting for ambulance, more stories out there. So the mayor's getting together, Jillian. Is this an effective form of pressuring the government? As I talked to the mayor of Clearwater this week, and he said, on our own, we're small, but together we might be a larger voice that gets government's attention. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think they, mayors, especially in rural communities, are very connected to their constituents. And I think they feel a very strong duty to elevate the pain that these communities are feeling from these kinds of tragedies. I think that, healthcare is the most important, the most sacred duty of provincial governments. And it's something like it's more than just a service. That the fact that we have this institution that provides this like basic level of care that's there for you in an emergency when you need it is something that I think is really like unifying and a big part of our provincial and national identity, the sense that we like take care of each other. And when that's pulled out from under you and it's not there anymore, I think that is an extremely serious, a very emotional issue for people. So I think that this is really effective. As spokespeople for their communities, I think they can really make that case to the provincial government. I think that they have to say that it's really scary that it's gotten to this point, and that this is something that we have to take really seriously. And that's what they're kind of doing with this like very serious ultimatum where they're threatening to withhold taxes. I think there's a sense that the government has been slow to respond to like sort of the level of crisis that the healthcare system is in. We've seen some movement. We saw the health minister come out with some stabilization funding to stop the bleeding in primary care, which is good. But even with that announcement, I think it really underscores, how big of a problem this is. I think that was 118 million. That's just only going to get us 4 months of stabilization funding. So this is like massive chronic underfunding. I think, the labor deal that we talked about is going to help. But there's a lot to make up for from decades of underfunding. And I think also I was going back and looking at there's a really great article from CBC that came out a couple months ago about the health policy starting in the 90s where we had too many family doctors. But that was actually not the case in rural communities. There was sort of an imbalance. So on top of the overall provincial crisis in primary care, rural and smaller communities have actually perhaps not been as big of the equation in terms of provincial planning. So that's why they're so much deeper into this emergency and why their elected officials are feeling like they have to sound the alarm in such a loud way.
Yeah. No, Jeff, I agree. Like, it is different in rural BC. And when I talked to the mayor of Clearwater, Merlin Blackwell, he said people are terrified. Mm-hmm. They're terrified. It's the number one issue that they talk to him about is that there might not be help if they need it, especially an older person who is worried that the ambulance might not show up. And so they're trying to elevate their small voices, Clearwater, population 2,400 people with no major industry, together with the other voices to express that to the government in a way. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think that these local elected officials are on the doorsteps during a local government election campaign. And when they're knocking on doors, their constituents are raising these fears with them. And I think they feel a duty to raise them to the province and I think that's a good thing that they're doing that. And mayors have. It's not just because it's during an election. I say that just because they're probably hearing from constituents more. But when I was in the Ministry of Health, mayors did this frequently. Maybe not in the public eye, but groups of mayors would get together and say, we're having problems attracting and retaining health workers in our community. And so I know one time we worked with the Northern Health Authority, and the Ministry of Health worked with the Northern Health Authority and asked $9 million for things ideas that they came to us, to the ministry with, like, we need affordable housing for health workers in our community, or they won't come here, or we need childcare for workers. And so the government funded that, and that made a difference. So I hope in the same respect that the mayors who do reflect the wishes of their community and who are quite constructive and solutions oriented will work with the ministry, and the ministry will take these this advocacy of theirs to heart and work with them to solve the issues.
Mm-hmm. There's such big issues. We talk about them almost every week. The ambulance crisis is not for lack of effort from government. It was a year ago, July last year, Health Minister Adrian Dix said they were solving this issue. I think they hired 500 people, and they converted 24 ambulance part-time stations on call to full-time. It was a massive investment, although they haven't been able to hire all those people. And it just feels like that problem has tilted from hiring people to they hired a bunch of people, but the on-call list now is empty. And so when those people are gone, there's no one to fill in. It's just like one problem to another. And the ER closures is staffing and COVID restrictions. Like, it's just, I mean, there's such enormous problems that can they even be solved in a realistic time frame? Are they multi-year, multi-billion, multi-government problems that didn't just appear overnight? Or, like, you know, people listening to this in communities where they're worried about this, like, is this even solvable in the foreseeable future? I wonder. I don't know if either of you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like I was saying, like, these problems are decades in the making, and it's not something that's going to be solved in one budget cycle. I think that it is unfortunate that it's taken us to get to this point to really have to say, like, hold on, this isn't working. There's something clearly very wrong here. We spend a lot of money on healthcare already. Like I said, just having that 4-month stabilization funding for primary care is a lot of money. But, you know, I was reading, Sonia Firstenow has a really great piece in the Business in Vancouver this week about healthcare administration. And, I don't know, like, I'm not an expert, but just looking at the numbers, she said Germany has one healthcare administrator for every 15,000 citizens, and Canada has one for every 1,400 citizens. BC has the highest per capita spending on healthcare administration of any province outside of Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, which is just because their populations are so small. $80 per person compared to $40 in Ontario and Quebec. So I think, you know, there's a lot to detangle here, and we have to think about how can we be getting, you know, if the issue is staffing, it's so hard to hire people right now, how can we be ensuring that all of this money that we're spending on healthcare is getting to frontline workers, to actually service delivery, because it's a dire situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 40% of the budget off the top for healthcare, Jeff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just jump in, and I hate being on panels and hearing people blaming or pointing fingers at others. But, you know, when I was in the Ministry of Health, and we were, I worked on that ambulance announcement with the minister, and you get the briefing from the public servants, and you look at the levels of investment historically, and you wonder, why didn't we make the investments when we were in the good times to get us ready so that we had the pipeline of workers and the stable system that we need today? And it's
probably because it wasn't a crisis.
Things were good, right?
You only handle government is troubleshooting crises at the time, right? So that's probably why.
It's focusing on other problems while ignoring or coasting on the fact that you're in a good spot, you know, a number of years ago. But the result is, and especially in a field like healthcare, where it takes years and years to train health workers, 7 years to train a doctor, for example, and that's not including their undergrad. You don't have the pipeline of people that you need to do the work, and then you get hit with COVID and the stress on workers, and especially with older workers, folks saying, like, that's just enough, and you don't have the sufficient pipeline, and you're doing your best to try and catch up, and you're investing money, but it takes years for the money to show some fruit and get you new workers and fix problems. It's a challenge, and I'm no big fan of lots of money spent on administration, but I'm not sure that putting all of the healthcare money into Victoria to have folks in Victoria do the health administration and take it further away from the community is going to help folks in rural communities where they have really unique challenges and needs, and the health authorities perform an important function of bringing that to light. I'm not suggesting that anyone's suggesting that, but if we're flagging administration as an issue and reducing it as a way to improve healthcare, I need to be convinced.
Sure, I guess. Although to carry on the argument, we should have invested in it earlier. I mean, I don't remember any political parties mentioning converting ambulance stations from on-call to full-time in their campaigns. And I don't remember that coming up at all the first couple of years of the New Democrat administration or the last few years of the Liberal administration. So I guess it's okay. I mean, I understand pointing back at it, and especially from a New Democrat side, to say, well, the Liberals left us with a bag hooey here. That's those strong language, by the way, mega hooey. And
Watch
we're
your
just
mouth.
doing the
I
best.
know this is the audio podcast and we can swear, but
bag of hooey. But I that argument, 5 years into a government, half a decade into a government, I have a harder time.
But I remember from that announcement that the government had invested $120 million more in ambulance care than when they'd taken office, and did that right away. So I think there are some areas where you can say, well, government waited till there was a crisis. But I think on this one,
I guess so. It's just one of those weird things, especially with healthcare. I think we see it in addictions right now too, where there's numberitis, governmentitis sometimes when we talk about this, like, 100 million here and 24 ambulance stations and da-da-da-da-da, and you list off all this number salad. And then, you have a voter in a community who dials 911 and nobody shows up. And that disconnect between government and reality. And I got a statement from the health ministry this week responding to the mayors of the rural communities, which was, it was not worth the email that it was sent on. It was utter garbage. And it was a complete disconnect. Again, it was like, we look forward to talking with rural communities about how to improve healthcare in their region. Oh, really? Maybe you should do that now. Like, I think that disconnect is the perpetual death of governments. I'm not talking about the NDP. I'm talking about all governments. When you start focusing on numbers and budgetary investments, and in the last 3 years, we invested 22% more than this, and we got 7 beds of treatment over here, and we got the Foundry Centers. Nobody cares if the system doesn't work in the real world. And that's the problem. This government, especially with this health minister who's memorized every number ever created by the health ministry, is it doesn't resonate.
You've got to be able to empathize with people in the community and their experience. And I could say $120 million more, and that was 55 more ambulances, and that was a bunch more helicopters. And if Joe in Ashcroft is saying the ambulance isn't showing up, then the system isn't working. And I get that. And so I'm not throwing out numbers to try and...
no, it's not you. It's government that throws out numbers, because healthcare is so expensive.
Even Troy Clifford, the head, and I'm sorry, I'll be quiet after this. I'm totally talking too much. But Troy Clifford with the paramedics union, on Twitter this week, Shirley Bond said, "Good job, Troy. We really appreciate the work that you're doing." And he's a sensible, constructive leader, and has been very vocal about the state of the ambulance system in the province over the last year, critical of government. And even he said, look, we're in the spot that we're in right now because of you. We're trying to catch up and fix this. So careful about making this a political issue, and spend more time working together as legislators to make a difference for people in communities who aren't getting the service they feel they need. Yeah,
I guess so. Although that, I just think...
I'm just trying to do a segue to the toxicity part.
Okay, that's right. That's a good. Okay, that's good. That's a good segue into toxicity, where I talked to the 3 leaders of all of BC's political parties in the last week or so, just to kind of gauge where everyone's at after the, really, I think, viral attack that occurred against Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland in Grand Prairie, where she was called horrendous names, shouted at by this large man in a lobby, called a traitor, a bunch of other profanity, and there was a big response from politicians that, man, the toxicity is increasing in politics at all levels. I think the pandemic really ratcheted it up, especially around vaccines and vaccine mandates. Suddenly we have death threats on MLAs here promoting vaccines. We have protesters occupying MLA offices, scaring their staff, refusing to leave. We have protesters showing up at the homes of MLAs. We had manure dumped on the steps of John Horgan's constituency office. Everyone is in agreement that things are getting worse, and that it's getting harder to recruit people into politics, Jillian, from all parties. Sonia Furstenau's traveling the province. Kevin Falcon's traveling the province. They're trying to drum up candidates for their parties. The NDP is doing that as well, though it's more focused on the leadership race right now. And they're trying to convince young people, especially younger women, hey, get into politics. But they're facing the reality that people see of just, it means you get shouted at and called horrendous names and your family might need RCMP protection. That's a tough sell to get someone in. And what do we do about that, I guess, is the question.
It's a really tough right now for all parties. I think are struggling with this. It's like, I think politics can be a rewarding job. I will say, anyone listening who's thinking about it, I was pretty cynical before I got into politics, but have been surprised at how it is possible to sort of get things done and to implement the kinds of changes that you want to see, and it can be encouraging. But that being said, I'm a staffer and I don't have the same target on my back that or was a staffer that a public figure has. I think there's a lot going on. I think during the pandemic, so much of political organizing and political communication had to move online like everything else, and I think social media really rewards toxicity because it, the more outrage that is generated, the more engagement that you get. And in a kind of perverse way, you're almost rewarded for that kind of engagement. And, I think
dunk on people and say the quickest hot take that snarkily takes someone down is the viral take. Who's that horrible guy that got banned from TikTok, Andrew Tate or whatever, that guy, he said that the ideal mix is something like having 60% supporters and 40% haters in your comments, because they feed each other and they drive that engagement, and the social media algorithms like that and think that that's a good thing, right? So I think that's one thing is asking, how can we have better forms of political discourse and engagement? Either how can we, use better tools online to facilitate that, or how can we kind of, now that, there's not as many public health restrictions, how can we get back to different kinds of political organizing and forums where people can behave a little bit better and there isn't those kind of perverse incentives. I also think that parties, though, should take some responsibility for their role in this. Like I said, there's that sort of incentive for outrage. There's also the incentive to demonize your opponents. People connect much more strongly with political figures, with the person, than they do with a party or with a policy. We're social creatures as humans. So, it's a potent and effective political strategy to really elevate the persona of your leaders in particular. But, we have this celebrity culture that loves to build people up and tear them down. And it becomes sort of leaders sort of become dehumanized. And I think that's a big part of what's driving it, which is, I don't know, the answer to that. I'm loath to bring up this example that the federal Greens are exploring a co-leadership model that's supposed to mitigate that. It is effectively used in other countries like Germany, but they got their own problems with toxicity as well. But I do think that it's a prudent time to be thinking outside of the box of this is a huge problem for our democracy. If we can't attract good people to lead us, we're not going to have good decisions and good outcomes. And, I think also having some sense of what are the red lines, whether you're an elected official or whether you're a comms person or an organizer, that you're just not going to cross and you're really going to hold yourself to, which is really hard, especially when you're in a campaign and it's a zero-sum game. But I think, for me, the ones when I'm working on a campaign and that I do hold myself as well as any staff that I'm managing to is staying away from personal attacks. So focus on policy, on people's records, but you don't attack them as a person. And also being honest. I think that there's an incentive because simple messages work really well, and strong differentiation and contrast work really well as communication tools. But I think that there's a way to do that while being honest and while not catering to conspiracy theories, catering or implying the sort of worst kinds of assumptions that people make about politicians, because I think that sort of just drags us all down into the gutter. But and there's accountability on everyone involved, including in the media too. And I can talk about that as we have a role and a problem in what we're doing. But you touched on, I think, the core of the issue, Jillian, which is, our modern politics elevates the leader to the brand, and then effective political messaging and attacks become at the leader and that person's credibility, and they're very personal, and they're very effective, and so that creates toxicity. I know staffers who hate the other party leaders. Like, they just hate them. And I don't even know if they can explain why. They view them as the personification of everything they hate. It filters down from the campaign to the messaging to the people that you hate your opponent. And I've never totally understood why we go that route, other than it's effective in terms of electoral politics. You win an election and you think, well, branding my opponent as evil and corrupt and on the take and only in it for themselves, whipping up supporters to hate that person and view their possibility of winning as the worst thing that could ever happen to this province. And then you win and you think, well, that was very effective. Let's do it next time. And I just, that, how do we get our heads around that, Jillian? Like, how do we change that when it works, I guess, is the political question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really has to come from the top, from leadership, to really have like a strong and consistent mandate across the organization, I think, is one thing. I think more like getting more into sort of, it's been a while since I've been in the legislature, but you brought me back with that vivid description. I think more opportunities in the legislature for people to work together are always healthy. And, we've seen some efforts to do that. I think having more than two parties in the legislature helps that a little bit. It makes the arguments and the issues a little bit less polarized. But I think there's boring stuff, but I think would be effective ways that we could do things differently, like having committees that have a little bit more teeth to their recommendations and the work that they do, because lots of good work does get done on those. I think we saw the Police Reform Act. We saw there's the ongoing one with the opioid response, toxic drug crisis response. More opportunities for people from all sides, because when you get the MLAs working together, then their staff works together. I think those sorts of things can help. I don't think any of them are a silver bullet. I think there's a lot more. One thing I've always thought is a cool idea, although the U.S. has such a toxic culture, but I think it's really cool how politicians from both parties can introduce legislation together and like co-author legislation. I think there's that, like I said, I think it's a time to really be thinking outside the box. Like, if our democracy isn't working, I think sometimes we take for granted that this is, democracy and the way that our systems of government function are these like immovable objects, but they actually are things that we created and continue to create. And if it's not working for us, we need to be asking ourselves, how can we make it better?
Yeah, I love that idea, co-sponsoring legislation. That would be very cool. Jeff, somewhere there's a new Democrat shouting, 2013, Adrian Dix ran a positive campaign and refused to go down this route. And I know that that's kind of, we laugh at that now, as this incredible mistake, and that 2013, the New Democrats lost, so they came back in 2017 in what was one of the most vicious election campaigns that I've covered, and won-ish, depending on how you view that election. I admire Adrian Dix for trying it, to be honest with you. I think he was taking that leadership to try and not have personal attacks and respond in that way, and it didn't work electorally. There's a lot of New Democrats who say that was an utter failure. But is that, like, how do we get our heads around that, and then winning, and then and all of the contradictions that come from toxicity in politics?
Well, I think that a good start would be for elected leaders to start treating their responsibilities at legislatures like governance and not like a sweater, right? If you think of people buying sweaters, this is what political strategists have in their mind. They're thinking of a marketing funnel. They're thinking of, I got to build awareness. I got to get people to consider me as an option and consider me against my opposition. And then I've got to convert them to a sale. And we're in this cycle where for the whole of time, we're in a perpetual campaign. And political parties and all political parties, and I think that was a good part of your column, was that it was all three parties acknowledging this is happening, and they all have a role to play, though they were quite light on offering solutions. But focus on you doing your job as in governing, and stop it with the marketing until it's a campaign. And then you could have the debate about, choices and why you're better than the other and why folks should vote for you. I like Jillian's idea about committees. I would take it a step further and say, just get rid of question period. Goodness gracious, it's tailor-made for that toxic culture that we have now of instant hateful reaction and simplistic thinking. If we have something that teachers won't let their students watch in our political institutions, then maybe we should consider getting rid of that thing and shifting that to publicly open and committees, and make that the focus of where our engagement is happening. Take estimates. Opposition critics have big blocks of time to ask lots and lots of questions of ministers and their staff. The questions are generally smart, on point. They're not name-calling exercises. People are constructive. The government provides good quality information, and there's no hollering and desk banging. And this is because they have time and there are no TV cameras. I would also say I think it's important to acknowledge important contributions from folks when they do it, even if they're from the legislative press gallery. So people who bring forward important issues and get people talking. So Rob, I want to wish Richard Zussman a very happy birthday. Many happy returns.
Legislature cat. Sorry. Yes, happy birthday, Richard. Yeah, no, I love estimates, Jeff. Yeah. I think they are really where the legislature works best, but they only happen once a year with budget. If we could create another process in the fall where we redo estimates in a different way. This is my 14th year covering politics, and for probably 11 of them, I would have said getting rid of question period is a horrible idea. That's where accountability happens. That's where you force ministers to step up and answer questions. But I've watched it for so long that it just doesn't work. And it's not a partisan thing. There are great ministers on all sides who they can't function in question period. It's a pressure cooker. They get up and just read lines that they've memorized because they can't. And there are other ministers who do great jobs answering, and you get a tiny bit of a sense of what the discussion could be, but just doesn't work. But there's got to be some way that we can have a debate over issues of the day without resorting to that. And I think, media, we have a role to play too. We need to highlight and better report on times when people agree and when the system's working well. And it's not sexy to just cover question period every day and battles and horse race and saber rattling in the House. Sometimes we do things in politics that everyone agrees on or everyone is working towards, and they don't get as much publicity and coverage as the negative things. And so we got to try and force feed some people some good news every now and again when the clicks would tell us they just want scandal and controversy, but that's a self-defeating way of doing journalism as well. So I hope we have a bigger discussion about this in politics. I hope that there's a way to sort of, you're right, end the perpetual campaigning. When you're in a campaign mode all the time, you're in an attack mode all the time on all sides. And it just doesn't work. We create the people that yelled at Chrystia Freeland by constantly telling them that the people who are from other parties are evil and have bad ideas and are trying to ruin our democracy /province /whatever. And we report that, and off it goes, and we sort of end up infuriating people who at different parts of their lives, at different stages of their lives, at different capacities, end up showing up in public forums screaming at other people as if they're
the
the devil.
Period.
And,
if they're question period.
That's right. You're in a way, yes.
How could this have happened?
It's a good point. I wish we could. I don't know what the solution is to question period that keeps accountability in play. The purpose of it was accountability, being able to every day to ask government to give us their thoughts on on this issue, or this is a problem. Like in some ways, we know from watching government that some ways that's the only way that a particular issue, disability bus pass in the Liberal government, or a prolific offender issue in this government, creates the political pressure required to make change.
Do written questions.
We don't want to lose that.
Do written questions. You could keep a question accountability where you have people submit their questions on paper. The questions are available to the public. The government has a duty to respond within a set period of time while the legislature is sitting, and you just get rid of the dynamic of the bad community theater that goes along with it. And if government dodges, they have no excuse of, well, we didn't have time to prepare. And
but you'd have to. There'd be responsibility on all sides to answer the question.
Absolutely.
We saw with the last speaker, a move to end heckling, which is this ancient tradition in the legislature. And the move to end heckling only works if the government answers. If the government stands up of any party and just reads a bunch of lines written by kids in short pants in the basement, no offense to any current or former staffers, but writing who aren't elected officials, and they just write, we remain committed to providing quality services for all British Columbians, Mr. Speaker, then of course you're going to heckle because it's garbage. So the answers have to be there as well. There has to be an engagement from
100%.
the ministers, and there has to be an engagement from the opposition, or else we end up in where we are right now, which is bad. So anyways, we can come back. I like the idea of coming back with some actual concrete solutions. Maybe one show we should just do how to fix politics and just kind of raise those type of issues.
Hopefully the cat helps. Hopefully the cat helps.
I think the cat would help people. Can you imagine a really just out of control question period where people are screaming about something and then the cat walks into the chamber, just starts plopping down on the floor there, jumping up on desks and rubbing against people's briefing binders? No one's going to be yelling at that point. Everyone's going to laugh. They're going to have a moment. They're going to say, thank God Rob Shaw got us a cat for this legislature. There'll be a statue of me. No, wait, that's not the point. The point is democracy is improved. But yeah, if you're listening, Mr. Speaker, let's get going on that cat. I think that's the first step. Anyways, okay, thank you, both of you, for being here on the show this week. That was great. I really enjoyed that discussion. Thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to get the latest episode in your pod box. We will be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital.